The California 1980 cold case that haunted Dana Point for 40 years finally found its ending in the most shocking way possible. Keith Harrington, 24, was studying to save lives as a medical student. His wife, Patrice, 27, already was working as a pediatric nurse with the gentlest hands in Orange County. On August 19, 1980, their gated community couldn't protect them from a predator who entered their home and destroyed everything they'd built together. Their brutal murders left behind broken families, a terrified neighborhood, and investigators with evidence but no answers. For decades, the case went cold while a monster walked free, hiding behind a badge in a quiet suburban life. But when cutting-edge DNA technology finally gave detectives the break they needed, the truth about who killed Keith and Patrice Harrington shattered everything this small coastal town believed about safety, trust, and the people living right next door. How long can evil hide in plain sight? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The California sun painted everything gold that August morning in 1980. Keith Harrington sat at his kitchen table, medical textbooks spread before him like battle plans. At 24, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where his life was heading. Every page he turned brought him closer to becoming the doctor he'd dreamed of being since childhood. "You're going to be late again," Patrice called from the bathroom, her voice carrying that familiar mix of affection and gentle scolding. At 27, she had already found her calling. The children at the pediatric ward lit up when they saw her coming down the hospital corridor. Her colleagues often said she had magic in her hands, the kind of touch that could calm a crying child or ease a worried parent's fears. Keith looked up from his anatomy textbook and smiled. Even after 2 years of marriage, the sound of her voice still made something warm unfold in his chest. Their Dana Point home was modest, but perfect for a young couple building their future together. The gated community offered safety and peace, exactly what they needed as they established their careers. "The kids need you more than I need to memorize the nervous system," Keith replied, closing his book. He walked to where Patrice stood, adjusting her nurse's uniform in the hallway mirror. Her reflection showed a woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, the same expression she wore in their wedding photos that lined the mantelpiece. "Dr. Harrington," she said, trying on his future title like a new dress. "I like the sound of that." Keith wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. "Mrs. Harrington sounds pretty good too." They stood there for a moment, young and happy and completely unaware that this ordinary Tuesday morning would be their last. Keith's brother had always been a worrier. It came from being the older sibling, the one who remembered their father's warnings about looking out for family. So when Keith failed to show up for their scheduled lunch on August 20th, something cold and sharp twisted in his stomach. Keith never missed appointments. Not study groups, not family dinners, and certainly not the monthly lunch meetings that had become their tradition since Keith started medical school. His brother drove to the Dana Point house with growing anxiety, telling himself he was overreacting even as his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The gated community looked exactly as it always did, peaceful, well-maintained, safe. Morning joggers passed by without concern. Sprinklers hissed softly across manicured lawns. Nothing seemed wrong until he reached Keith and Patrice's front door. It stood slightly ajar. Keith's brother knocked first, calling out their names. His voice echoed strangely in the morning air. When no one answered, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house felt different, too quiet, too still. A chair lay overturned in the living room. Dark stains marked the carpet. "Keith?" he called again, his voice cracking. "Patrice?" He found them in the bedroom. The scene burned itself into his memory with brutal clarity. Keith's body near the bed, Patrice on the floor nearby. Blood. So much blood. The violence was overwhelming, senseless, complete. Keith's brother stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he reached for the phone. The 911 operator's voice seemed to come from very far away. He gave the address, tried to explain what he'd found, but the words felt inadequate for the horror spread before him. When the sirens finally arrived, they shattered the morning calm of Dana Point like breaking glass. Detective Sarah Martinez had seen plenty of crime scenes in her 15 years with the Orange County Sheriff's Department, but the Harrington house left her shaken. The violence was methodical, calculated. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a domestic dispute. Someone had come here with a specific purpose. "What do we know about the victims?" she asked the responding officer, careful to keep her voice steady and professional. "Keith Harrington, 24, medical student. Wife Patrice, 27, pediatric nurse at Orange County Children's Hospital. No known enemies, no financial troubles. Model citizens, by all accounts." Martinez walked through the house, cataloging evidence with practiced efficiency. The killer had been thorough but not perfect. Ligatures suggested premeditation. The sexual assault component indicated this might not be the perpetrator's first crime. Most importantly, there was biological evidence samples that could one day identify the monster who had done this. The neighbors gathered outside in small clusters, their voices hushed with shock and disbelief. This was supposed to be a safe community, protected by gates and security systems. How had someone gotten in? How had they targeted such a seemingly perfect couple? Any witnesses? Martinez asked. No one saw anything unusual. No strange cars, no suspicious activity. The security guard didn't notice anyone who didn't belong. Martinez nodded grimly. Professional criminals knew how to blend in, how to study their targets without drawing attention. This killer had patience and skill, a dangerous combination. As the evidence technicians worked, photographing and cataloging every detail, Martinez made herself a promise: Keith and Patrice Harrington would get justice. However long it took, whoever was responsible would pay for this brutality. She had no idea it would take 40 years. The church couldn't hold everyone who came to say goodbye. Keith and Patrice's funeral drew hundreds of people: medical school classmates, hospital staff, neighbors from Dana Point, family members who had traveled from across the country. The parking lot overflowed. People stood along the walls inside, creating a sea of black clothing and tear-stained faces. Keith's brother sat in the front row, still struggling to process what had happened. Just days earlier, he had been planning to tease Keith about his terrible study habits. Now he was choosing readings for a funeral service that felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Patrice's colleagues from the children's hospital formed their own section, many still wearing their hospital badges. They spoke in whispers about the children who kept asking when Miss Patrice would be back, about the tiny patients who had drawn get-well cards for someone who would never return. The pastor's words about God's plan and eternal peace felt hollow against the weight of such senseless loss. How could there be meaning in brutality? How could two people who dedicated their lives to healing others be taken in such a violent way? After the service, the community gathered for a reception that felt more like a wake. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now clung to each other, united by shared fear and grief. Parents held their children a little tighter. Couples walked closer together. The sense of safety that had defined Dana Point was gone, shattered along with two promising lives. "We have to catch whoever did this," someone whispered. But as days turned into weeks without arrests, that hope began to fade into something harder and more bitter: the knowledge that sometimes evil wins, at least temporarily. Autumn brought new cases but no new leads in the Harrington murders. Detective Martinez's desk became a shrine to the investigation: crime scene photos, witness statements, forensic reports, and a growing collection of dead ends. Every suspect they interviewed had alibis. Every lead faded into nothing. The pressure from the community was enormous. Dana Point wanted answers, wanted to know they were safe in their homes. The media attention was relentless, with reporters calling daily for updates that Martinez couldn't provide. How do you tell a grieving community that your prime suspect list is empty? They checked and rechecked Keith's medical school connections. Someone jealous of his success? A patient's family seeking revenge? Nothing fit. Patrice's work at the children's hospital was equally clean. No disgruntled parents, no workplace conflicts, no romantic entanglements. The biological evidence was their best hope, but 1980 forensic science had limitations. They could determine blood types, confirm sexual assault, identify some basic markers, but without a suspect to compare against, even perfect evidence was useless. Martinez found herself driving past the Harrington house on her days off, as if proximity to the crime scene might reveal new clues. The yellow tape was gone now. New owners had moved in, trying to make a fresh start in a house marked by tragedy. Maybe it was random, her partner suggested, one gray November afternoon. Wrong place, wrong time. But Martinez shook her head. The evidence pointed to planning, preparation, familiarity with the neighborhood. This killer had chosen Keith and Patrice specifically, had watched them, had learned their routines. Somewhere out there, a monster was walking free, probably planning his next attack. By early 1981, the Harrington investigation had settled into a painful routine of false hopes and crushing disappointment. The families learned to live with an absence that echoed through every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary moment that should have been shared with Keith and Patrice. Keith's parents found themselves unable to enter their son's childhood bedroom. His medical school textbook still sat on his desk, bookmarked at chapters he would never finish. His mother kept expecting him to call on Sundays, the way he always had. The phone would ring, and for just a moment, hope would flare before reality crashed back down. Patrice's family struggled with different demons. They had lost their youngest daughter, the baby who had grown up to heal children and spread joy wherever she went. Her nursing colleagues sent cards and flowers, but what comfort could they offer? How do you replace someone who made the world brighter simply by existing? The couple's friends found their own relationships strained by the tragedy. Young marriages felt fragile when confronted with such sudden, violent loss. If it could happen to Keith and Patrice, so happy, so perfect, then no one was truly safe. Keith's brother threw himself into work, desperate for distraction from the guilt that gnawed at him. He should have insisted on daily check-ins. He should have arrived earlier that morning. He should have done something, anything, to prevent the horror he had discovered. The Dana Point community tried to return to normal, but normal no longer existed. Home security systems became standard. Neighbors watched each other's houses more carefully. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them ride bikes alone. Fear had moved in permanently, making itself comfortable in every kitchen, every bedroom, every place where people once felt safe. The mid-1980s brought a troubling pattern to California law enforcement. Reports were filtering in from across the state, home invasions, rapes, murders that shared disturbing similarities. East Sacramento, Stockton, Modesto, Goleta, always at night, always planned, always brutal. Detective Martinez, now promoted and working different cases, still kept the Harrington file on her desk. When news of the East Area Rapist reached Orange County, she pulled out the crime scene photos and compared them to the new reports. The methodology was eerily similar: ligatures, careful planning, sexual assault, extreme violence. Could Keith and Patrice have been early victims of a serial predator? The idea both excited and horrified the investigation team. If they were dealing with a serial offender, it meant more families were suffering, more communities were being terrorized. But it also meant more evidence, more opportunities to catch the person responsible. They began reaching out to other jurisdictions, comparing notes, looking for connections. The East Area Rapist had attacked dozens of victims in Northern California. The original Night Stalker was linked to murders in Southern California. Could they be the same person? Could Keith and Patrice's killer be part of something much larger? The evidence suggested yes, but proving it was another matter entirely. Each jurisdiction guarded its own cases jealously. Cooperation was slow and bureaucratic. By the time information was shared and analyzed, the trail had grown even colder. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. More families shattered, more communities living in fear, and somewhere in California, a predator continued to hunt, confident that law enforcement couldn't touch him. The Harrington case was no longer about two victims in Dana Point. It had become part of a much larger nightmare. By 1990, the Harrington case had officially gone cold. The active investigation ended not with drama, but with quiet resignation, budget cuts, personnel changes, and the simple reality that new crimes demanded attention while old ones faded into memory. Detective Martinez retired in 1989, her replacement inheriting dozens of cold cases along with the impossible task of keeping them all alive in public consciousness. The Harrington file was moved from an active desk to a storage cabinet, then to a warehouse, joining thousands of other unsolved cases from across Orange County. Keith's brother had stopped calling for updates. What was the point? The same answer every time. No new leads, no new suspects, no progress at all. He had learned to live with the weight of unfinished business, though it never got easier. The families held private memorial services on the 10th anniversary of the murders. No media coverage this time, no public pleas for information. Just a small gathering of people who remembered Keith and Patrice as more than victims, more than a cold case file gathering dust. New detectives cycled through the cold case unit, each one briefly reviewing the Harrington evidence before moving on to cases with better prospects. The biological samples remained preserved in evidence storage, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist. Dana Point had moved on as much as any community can move on from such trauma. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children who weren't even born in 1980 played in the same parks where Keith and Patrice once walked. The security gates still stood, but they no longer provided the comfort they once had. Time moved forward, as it always does, carrying the living further from the dead but never quite letting them forget. The 1990s brought revolutionary changes to forensic science. DNA analysis transformed from a theoretical concept to a practical tool that could identify suspects with unprecedented accuracy. Cold case units across the country began revisiting their oldest files, looking for biological evidence that could finally provide answers. Detective James Chen inherited the Harrington case in 1994, part of a new cold case unit established specifically to take advantage of advancing forensic technology. The evidence from 1980 had been carefully preserved, and early DNA analysis confirmed what investigators had long suspected: they had a clear genetic profile of the killer. The profile was entered into the newly created Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a national database that could link crimes across jurisdictions. For the first time since 1980, there was real hope that Keith and Patrice's killer might be identified, but hope proved premature. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in the system. No convicted offenders, no suspects from other cases, no hits at all. The killer had managed to avoid leaving his genetic signature in any law enforcement database. Still, the technology represented progress. Chen began reaching out to other jurisdictions with similar unsolved cases, comparing DNA profiles and crime scene evidence. The East Area Rapist cases from Northern California were being re-examined with the same new technology. What they discovered was remarkable and terrifying in equal measure. The same DNA profile appeared in crime scenes across California, spanning more than a decade. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the killer of Keith and Patrice Harrington were the same person. They were hunting not just a murderer, but one of the most prolific serial offenders in American history. The late 1990s brought the official recognition of what investigators had suspected for years. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person, responsible for dozens of rapes, 13 confirmed murders, and countless other crimes across California. Keith and Patrice Harrington were among his earliest murder victims. Detective Chen found himself coordinating with law enforcement agencies throughout the state. Each jurisdiction had pieces of the puzzle: witness descriptions, crime scene evidence, behavioral analysis profiles. Together, they began to build a comprehensive picture of their suspect. He was methodical, patient, and skilled at surveillance. He often called victims before and after attacks, using a distinctive whisper that suggested he enjoyed the psychological torment as much as the physical violence. He seemed to know police procedures, possibly indicating law enforcement training or experience. The composite sketches from different incidents showed variations, but certain features remained consistent: a young to middle-aged white male with an athletic build. Witnesses described him as unremarkable, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd. What made the investigation particularly frustrating was the suspect's apparent familiarity with police work. He avoided leaving fingerprints, cleaned crime scenes to minimize evidence, and seemed to know exactly how investigations would unfold. Some detectives theorized that he might be a police officer himself, or at least someone with inside knowledge of law enforcement procedures. The psychological profile painted a picture of someone who enjoyed power and control, who found satisfaction in terrorizing entire communities. The phone calls he made to victims and police showed a person who believed he was untouchable, smarter than everyone hunting him. For families like Keith and Patrice's, the expanded scope of the crimes brought mixed emotions: validation that their loved ones were victims of a serial killer, but horror at the magnitude of suffering this one person had caused. The early 2000s saw the formation of victim advocacy groups that brought together families affected by the East Area Rapist, divided by original Night Stalker crimes. Keith's brother attended his first meeting in 2002, more than 20 years after discovering the bodies of Keith and Patrice. The gathering took place in a community center conference room, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on a circle of folding chairs. Each family represented a different crime, a different year, but the pain was universal. Parents who had lost children, survivors who had endured unspeakable trauma, siblings carrying guilt they couldn't shake. Keith's brother listened as other families shared their stories. The Harringtons weren't the only young couple targeted. The killer seemed to prefer attacking people who represented normalcy, happiness, success, as if he wanted to destroy the very things he couldn't have himself. What struck him most was how articulate grief had made everyone. These weren't professional speakers, but trauma had given them voices they'd never wanted to have. They spoke of anniversaries that would never be celebrated, grandchildren who would never exist, holidays forever marked by absence. The group served multiple purposes beyond emotional support. They coordinated with law enforcement, kept pressure on investigators, and maintained public awareness of the unsolved crimes. They understood that cases grew cold not just because of lack of evidence, but because of lack of attention. "Our loved ones deserve better than dusty file cabinets," one mother said, and everyone nodded. They would not let Keith and Patrice become just another cold case statistic. They would be voices for the voiceless, demanding justice even decades after the crimes. They would not be silent. They would not give up. By 2010, the cold case unit had definitively connected the Harrington murders to at least 12 other homicides and 50 rapes across California. DNA evidence provided irrefutable proof that one person was responsible for a decades-long reign of terror that had traumatized entire communities. Detective Chen, now a veteran of the cold case unit, had become something of an expert on the East Area Rapist divided by original Night Stalker case. He kept detailed charts, mapping the crimes chronologically and geographically, looking for patterns that might reveal the killer's identity or whereabouts. The suspect had been remarkably active between 1976 and 1986, then seemed to stop completely. Did he die? Move away? Get arrested for something unrelated? The sudden cessation of crimes was as puzzling as the crimes themselves. What frustrated investigators most was the certainty that this person was still alive somewhere, probably living a normal life, while his victims' families continued to suffer. The DNA profile sat in databases worldwide, waiting for a match that never came. Public interest in the case had been renewed by crime television shows and online forums where amateur investigators discussed theories and evidence. The internet had created a community of people obsessed with solving the case, though their enthusiasm sometimes complicated official investigations. Keith's brother had mixed feelings about the renewed attention. Part of him was grateful that people still cared about Keith and Patrice after 30 years, but part of him was exhausted by the endless speculation, the conspiracy theories, the certainty that the next breakthrough was just around the corner. The DNA was solid, the evidence was clear. They knew exactly who they were looking for. They just didn't know his name. April 2018 brought a revolution to cold case investigations that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. Detective Paul Holes, working with the FBI and a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter, had developed a new approach to identifying unknown suspects: forensic genetic genealogy. The process was elegant in its simplicity. Crime scene DNA was uploaded to G-Deadmatch, a public genealogy website where people shared their genetic information to find relatives. By analyzing genetic matches and building family trees, investigators could work backward to identify potential suspects. For the East Area Rapist case, the technique was about to make history. On April 18, 2018, the crime scene DNA from the Harrington murders and other connected crimes was uploaded to G-Deadmatch under a pseudonym. Within hours, the system had identified distant relatives of the unknown suspect. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore began the painstaking work of building family trees, following genetic breadcrumbs through generations of ancestors and descendants. The work required incredible patience and skill. Each branch of the family tree had to be traced through birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data. False leads where common genetic matches could indicate cousins several times removed, making the suspect pool enormous. But slowly, methodically, the tree began to narrow. Names were eliminated through alibis, age ranges, geographic locations. The circle of possibilities grew smaller and smaller until one name emerged as the most likely candidate: Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer living in Citrus Heights, California. The irony was devastating. The man who had terrorized California for decades, who seemed to know police procedures so well, had been a police officer himself. He had hidden behind a badge while destroying countless lives. Finally, after 38 years, they had a name. The surveillance of Joseph DeAngelo required extraordinary discretion. If he was indeed the East Area Rapist, divided by original Night Stalker, he had evaded capture for decades and would be extremely dangerous if he suspected he was being watched. Detective Chen, now part of a multi-agency task force, participated in round-the-clock surveillance of the Citrus Heights home, where DeAngelo lived with his adult daughter and granddaughter. The irony was inescapable. A man who had spent years terrorizing families was now living peacefully with his own family, who presumably had no idea what he had done. DeAngelo appeared to be a typical elderly retiree. He worked in his garden, went grocery shopping, attended family gatherings. Nothing in his behavior suggested the monster they knew him to be. It was a chilling reminder of how successfully psychopaths could hide among normal society. The challenge was obtaining a DNA sample that would hold up in court. They needed something DeAngelo had touched and discarded, something that couldn't be challenged as illegally obtained evidence. The breakthrough came on April 23, 2018. DeAngelo visited a Hobby Lobby store in Roseville, California. Surveillance teams watched him park, enter the store, make a purchase, and return to his car. What he didn't notice was the team of investigators who collected the items he had touched and discarded a car door handle, a piece of trash, small but invaluable pieces of evidence. The DNA samples were rushed to the laboratory for analysis. Within days, they had confirmation. Joseph DeAngelo's DNA was a perfect match to the evidence collected from Keith and Patrice Harrington's murder scene in 1980. After 38 years, they finally had their killer. The arrest of Joseph DeAngelo took place on April 24, 2018, just outside his Citrus Heights home. After decades of hunting shadows, law enforcement officers were finally facing the man who had terrorized California and murdered Keith and Patrice Harrington. Detective Chen was among the officers present for the arrest. As DeAngelo emerged from his house to retrieve items from his car, officers moved in. The man who had once been described as athletic and dangerous now appeared frail and confused. A 72-year-old grandfather who seemed shocked by the sudden appearance of police. "Joseph DeAngelo, you're under arrest for the murders of Keith and Patrice Harrington," Chen announced, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The words he had imagined speaking for 24 years finally became reality. DeAngelo offered no resistance. He was handcuffed and placed in a patrol car without saying a word. His daughter and granddaughter emerged from the house, their faces filled with confusion and horror, as they watched the man they thought they knew being taken away for crimes they couldn't imagine. News of the arrest spread rapidly through law enforcement channels before breaking to the public. Keith's brother received the call he had been waiting for since 1980. After nearly 4 decades, the man who had destroyed his family was finally in custody. The arrest made international headlines. The East Area Rapist, divided by original Night Stalker case, had captivated crime enthusiasts for years, and the resolution through genetic genealogy was being hailed as a breakthrough that would revolutionize cold case investigations. But for the families of Keith and Patrice Harrington, the arrest was just the beginning. Now came the long process of seeking justice through the courts. The legal proceedings that followed D'Angelo's arrest were complex and emotionally grueling for everyone involved. Keith's brother found himself attending hearings and meetings with prosecutors, reliving the trauma of 1980 while preparing for what would likely be the most important trial of his lifetime. The prosecution team, led by experienced prosecutors who specialized in cold cases, faced the challenge of presenting evidence that was nearly 40 years old. Witnesses had died, memories had faded, and some physical evidence had degraded over time. But the DNA evidence was solid, and D'Angelo's crimes had been so extensive that prosecutors had multiple cases to pursue. The defense strategy became clear early on. D'Angelo's attorneys would not dispute the DNA evidence, but would instead focus on his mental state and age. At 72, he was a frail shadow of the man who had committed these crimes in the 1970s and 1980s. The defense would argue that executing or imprisoning for life such an elderly man served no purpose. Keith's brother struggled with his feelings about D'Angelo's appearance in court. This wasn't the monster he had imagined for 38 years. This was just an old man who seemed confused and fragile. But when he looked at crime scene photos, when he remembered finding Keith and Patrice's bodies, the anger returned full force. The families of all the victims faced a terrible choice: pursue the death penalty and endure years of additional trials and appeals, or accept a plea agreement that would ensure D'Angelo died in prison but spare everyone the extended trauma of capital proceedings. It was an impossible decision with no good answers, only the hope that some form of justice might finally be served. On June 29, 2020, Joseph D'Angelo stood in a Sacramento County courtroom and quietly entered his plea, guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder, including the deaths of Keith and Patrice Harrington. The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of 4 decades of denial and deception. Keith's brother sat in the gallery, flanked by other family members who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. The courtroom was packed with families of victims, law enforcement officers who had worked the case, and members of the media documenting the end of one of California's most notorious criminal careers. The plea agreement was comprehensive and damning. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, D'Angelo admitted not only to the murders, but also to dozens of rapes, hundreds of burglaries, and countless other crimes that had terrorized communities throughout California. He would receive multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Keith's brother, the guilty plea was both vindication and anticlimax. After 38 years of wondering, the truth was finally official. But hearing D'Angelo's quiet guilty couldn't restore his brother's life or give Patrice the chance to save more children. Justice was being served, but it felt incomplete. The prosecution read a detailed summary of D'Angelo's crimes, connecting him definitively to the East Area Rapist attacks in Northern California and the original Night Stalker murders in Southern California. The scope of his criminal career was staggering: more than 40 years of violence that had left hundreds of victims and shattered countless families. As D'Angelo was led away in shackles, Keith's brother felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. The monster finally had a face and a name, but the victory felt hollow after such a long wait. The victim impact hearings in August 2020 provided families with their first opportunity to address Joseph D'Angelo directly. Keith's brother had prepared his statement carefully, writing and rewriting it dozens of times as he tried to capture 38 years of pain, anger, and loss in just a few minutes of speaking time. Keith was going to be a doctor, he began, his voice steady but strained. He wanted to save lives. Patrice already was saving lives, working with children who needed her gentle hands and kind heart. You stole all of that. You stole their future, their children they would never have, the lives they would never touch. Around the courtroom, other family members waited their turns to speak. Some had prepared elaborate statements detailing decades of trauma and loss. Others planned to speak from the heart, letting their raw emotions guide their words. All of them shared the same goal: making sure D'Angelo understood the magnitude of destruction he had caused. Patrice's sister spoke about the children who had lost their favorite nurse, about parents who had trusted their most precious gifts to someone who would never come home. She described waiting for phone calls that never came, birthdays that would never be celebrated, grandchildren who would never exist. D'Angelo sat silently throughout the proceedings, showing no visible emotion as family after family described how his actions had destroyed their lives. His apparent indifference only added to their pain. Even now, facing the consequences of his crimes, he seemed incapable of genuine remorse. The statements continued for hours, a litany of loss that painted a devastating picture of one man's impact on hundreds of lives. For many families, this was their first and only chance to confront the person who had taken so much from them. The moment Keith's brother had imagined for 38 years finally arrived on August 17, 2020. He stood at a podium in the Sacramento County courtroom, looking directly at Joseph DeAngelo for the first time. This was the man who had murdered Keith and Patrice. This was the face of evil that had haunted his nightmares. DeAngelo appeared smaller than expected, frailer, almost insignificant. He sat in his orange jail jumpsuit, head slightly bowed, refusing to make eye contact with any of the family members who addressed him. His lawyers flanked him on either side, but he seemed utterly alone. "Look at me," Keith's brother demanded. "Look at what you've done to my family." DeAngelo kept his eyes downcast, his hands folded in his lap. The man who had once terrorized entire communities now seemed incapable of facing the consequences of his actions. His silence felt like a final act of cruelty toward the families who had waited so long for this confrontation. Other family members approached the podium with their own demands for acknowledgement. They wanted him to see their pain, to understand the ripple effects of his violence that had spread through generations. Children who had grown up without parents, siblings who carried guilt they didn't deserve, communities that had lost their sense of safety and trust. But DeAngelo remained motionless and mute, offering nothing that could be interpreted as remorse or understanding. He had spent decades hiding behind a mask of normalcy, and even now, facing the ultimate consequences, he refused to show his true face. For Keith's brother, the lack of response was somehow fitting. Evil rarely explains itself. Monsters don't offer apologies that could possibly matter. Judge Michael Bowman's voice carried the weight of finality as he prepared to sentence Joseph DeAngelo on August 21, 2020. The courtroom was packed with family members, law enforcement officials, and members of the media who had followed this case for decades. Outside, protesters and supporters maintained vigil, knowing that this moment would close one of California's most notorious criminal cases. "Mr. DeAngelo," Judge Bowman began, "you committed offenses which were reprehensible and which cry out for justice. The scope of your crimes is simply staggering. Each time you escaped apprehension, you continued your reign of terror." Keith's brother listened from the gallery as the judge detailed the specific charges and corresponding sentences. Multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. DeAngelo would spend whatever remained of his life in prison, just as Keith and Patrice had spent their final moments in terror. The judge's words carried particular meaning when he addressed the Harrington murders specifically. Keith Harrington was a medical student with dreams of healing others. Patrice Harrington was already fulfilling that calling as a pediatric nurse. "You extinguished two bright lights that could have illuminated countless other lives." As the sentences were pronounced, Keith's brother felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that justice was finally being served, anger that it had taken 40 years, sadness that Keith and Patrice would never know their killer had been caught, exhaustion from carrying this burden for so long. When Judge Bowman brought down the gavel for the final time, DeAngelo was led away in shackles. He would be transferred to a maximum security prison where he would remain until his death. The East Area Rapist, divided by original Night Stalker chapter of California's criminal history, was finally closed. The weeks following DeAngelo's sentencing brought an unexpected challenge for the families of his victims, learning how to live without the case that had defined their lives for decades. Keith's brother found himself at loose ends, no longer needing to attend hearings or meet with prosecutors or give interviews to reporters investigating new angles. The justice system had done its work. DeAngelo was in prison where he would remain until his death. The case was closed. But closure, Keith's brother discovered, was more complicated than he had expected. For 38 years, the pursuit of Keith and Patrice's killer had provided structure and purpose to his grief. There were always investigators to call, evidence to review, hope to maintain that someday there would be answers. Now that the answers had come, he wasn't sure what to do with the empty space they left behind. The family held a private memorial service 6 weeks after the sentencing. They gathered at Keith's parents' house. His father had died years earlier, but his mother, now 93, wanted to mark the end of their long wait for justice. She had lived to see her son's killer convicted, something she had once feared would never happen. They lit candles for Keith and Patrice, the flames flickering in the evening breeze as family members shared memories that had nothing to do with murder or trials or DNA evidence. They remembered Keith's terrible jokes and his dedication to his studies. They remembered Patrice's laugh and her way with children. For the first time in decades, Keith and Patrice were more than victims. They were family members who were missed and loved and remembered for who they had been, not just how they had died. Dana Point had changed significantly since 1980, but the community hadn't forgotten Keith and Patrice Harrington. When news of D'Angelo's conviction reached the coastal town, longtime residents felt a mixture of vindication and renewed grief. The couple who had been brutally murdered in their gated community finally had justice, but it had come 40 years too late. The city council voted unanimously to establish a small memorial garden in the park where Keith and Patrice used to walk during their evening strolls. Local volunteers donated plants, benches, and a brass plaque that would ensure their memory lived on in the community that had mourned them for so long. The dedication ceremony was simple but moving. Neighbors who had known Keith and Patrice personally stood alongside residents who had moved to Dana Point decades after the murders but had heard the story passed down through community memory. The police chief spoke about the importance of never giving up on victims, no matter how much time passes. Keith's brother planted the first flowers in the memorial garden, sunflowers, because Patrice had always loved their cheerful faces turned toward the Sunday. Other family members added roses, Keith's favorite, and herbs that Patrice had grown in her own garden during the brief time she had lived in Dana Point. The memorial represented something important to the community, proof that evil doesn't get the final word. Keith and Patrice were remembered not as victims, but as young people who had brought light into the world during their short lives. Their killer was forgotten in a prison cell, but their memory would bloom each spring in the flowers planted in their honor. The community had healed, slowly and imperfectly, but it had healed nonetheless. The resolution of the Golden State Killer case became a watershed moment in criminal justice history. News outlets across the country and around the world covered the story of how Genealogy had finally solved one of America's most notorious cold cases. Keith and Patrice Harrington's names appeared in headlines from coast to coast, their story becoming part of a larger narrative about justice, technology, and the power of never giving up. True crime television shows produced documentaries about the case, interviewing family members, detectives, and the genetic genealogists who had made the breakthrough possible. Keith's brother found himself reluctantly participating in some of these productions, recognizing that keeping the story in public consciousness might help other cold case families find resolution. The case also sparked important conversations about privacy, DNA databases, and the ethics of using genetic information for law enforcement purposes. Some praised the technique as a revolutionary tool for justice. Others worried about the implications for personal privacy and genetic rights. Law enforcement agencies across the country began adopting genetic genealogy techniques for their own cold cases. The Harrington case became a template, a proof of concept that even decades-old crimes could still be solved with the right technology and determination. For Keith's brother, the media attention was bittersweet. He was grateful that people remembered Keith and Patrice, but he was exhausted by the constant requests for interviews and comments. The case had consumed his life for 40 years, and he was ready to let other people tell the story while he focused on remembering his brother and sister-in-law as more than just crime victims. The headlines would fade, but the precedent had been set. Justice delayed did not have to mean justice denied. 4 decades after Keith and Patrice Harrington were murdered in their Dana Point home, their story had finally reached its conclusion. The legal proceedings were over, the killer was in prison, and the families were learning to navigate a world where justice had been served, but their loved ones were still gone. Keith's brother, now in his 70s, spent quiet evenings looking through photo albums that spanned his family's history. There were pictures of Keith as a child, excited about his first day of school, photos from Keith and Patrice's wedding, both of them radiant with happiness and hope. Images from family gatherings that would be the last times they were all together. But now there were new photos too. Images from the trial, from memorial services, from the dedication of the Dana Point Garden. Pictures of a family that had survived the worst kind of trauma and found ways to honor the memory of those they had lost. The long vigil was finally over, but its end brought unexpected challenges. Without the case to focus on, grief returned in different forms. Keith's brother found himself mourning not just his brother's death, but all the years that had been consumed by the pursuit of his killer. 40 years of birthdays marked by sadness instead of celebration, holidays shadowed by absence instead of filled with joy. Yet there was also relief. The question that had haunted his family for 4 decades had finally been answered. Keith and Patrice's killer had a name and a face, and a prison cell where he would spend his remaining years. The monster who had hidden in plain sight for so long had finally been exposed. Justice had been served. The vigil was over. Keith and Patrice could finally rest in peace.